And during the presentation, he'll pause every now and then through the presentation to allow any comments or questions or feedback. You can certainly use the chat, or you can also raise your hand. And then after the formal presentation, which will run till about 12:40 or so, we will have an opportunity to bring the panel in. And we have 3 panelists here who you'll be able to offer questions to, or even also if you want to make comments as well. And then time permitting, at the very end of the panel discussion, I'm going to pose some questions to the panel. At the end of it, if we have an opportunity toward the end, I'll also give you an opportunity to ask questions at that time. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
Very good. Thank you very much, Lonnie. And again, welcome everyone to today's session. And like Lonnie mentioned, we really want this session to be engaging. We don't want just to have y'all just stare at a computer screen with a bunch of faces. So please engage with us. Please use a chat function. I'm going to have some word clouds and do some polls, and occasionally we'll take some pauses to have folks come off of mute and share their thoughts and comments. So we really do look forward to having one engage in today's discussion. And really, for today's session, what we want to do is break down in greater detail this concept of equity. And as we think about what does equity really mean, I'm sure we've all seen some version of this picture and icon, right, to explain equity. And I love this particular icon on the slide because it's a great cursory introduction and a great way to start thinking about equity and recognizing that different folks need different opportunities and different resources in order to level the playing field, right, with others. But what what we want to do in this session is to take a deeper dive into the concept of equity and look at equity strictly from a business perspective in terms of what does equity actually look like within an organization in terms of the everyday business dealings, and what are some of the best practices that we all should be incorporating within our organization to enhance equity. Now, this particular title is intentional about looking at the quote unquote historical context of equity, because for me, I think one of the biggest misconceptions about equity right now is that it's thought of as this brand new concept. It's kind of thought of as like the new flavor of the month, right? And I've heard some naysayers even say, you know what, just give it a few years and equity's no longer going to be at the forefront. And I think part of that kind of negative sentiment around equity and those misconceptions, thinking about it's this brand new concept, I think a lot of that stems from the fact that in the last couple of years, companies have started to rebrand their diversity and inclusion efforts by now explicitly adding equity in that title, right? And so the purpose of this title is to really help folks understand that equity is not a new concept, and it's actually been formalized and codified in our federal regulations dating all the way back to the 1960s with federal regulations like Title VII, equal employment opportunity laws, or affirmative action regulations. And I think it's important for folks to understand that equity, it's not going anywhere, y'all. It's here to stay. And so we're going to talk through how do the federal regulations continue to keep organizations honest to ensure equity, all right? But before we do a deep dive into equity, I would love to hear from y'all, and again, kind of do some engagement with y'all. I'd love to hear from our attendees beyond the general misconception of thinking about equity as this brand new concept. I'd love to hear from y'all. What are some other myths and misconceptions that you're hearing out there when it comes to the concept of equity? So why don't I do a quick a word cloud? And just in a few words or even one word, I'd love for y'all to type in what are some of those misconceptions and confusion around equity that you're witnessing. Seeing unfair, preference, equal. All right, very good. Yeah, I definitely agree that there's a lot of folks that think equality and equity are the same things. Politicized, yes. We are definitely going to talk about how equity and affirmative action is politicized and break down what that really means. FOMO, that's interesting. Fear of missing out. All right. Majority, unfair, biased. Hand down. Very good. Yeah, so I think a lot of these misconceptions around equity, we definitely need to address. And so these are some of the big things that we will be addressing in today's session. Now, let me close this poll. Now, just to kind of further help clarify and simplify equity for us, I think it's good for us to break down the concept of equity for folks into these major choices and major actions that organizations regularly make when it comes to their talent. So these actions and choices, they boil down to how do we hire? How do we recruit? How do we promote? And how do we professionally develop? And I think you can also ask, when it comes to having a equity lens, you can also ask who for all these questions, right? Who are we hiring? Who are we recruiting? Who are we promoting? And who are we professionally developing, right? And all of these big questions are meant to get organizations to think about their talent from an equity lens and understanding what are the key actions, what are the strategies that we should be taking to address any areas in our organization where we're seeing an underrepresentation of a particular group, and also be thinking about what are our internal policies and procedures that either allow folks from all backgrounds and identities to thrive, or are there any barriers in place that prevents folks from, again, having that level playing field? But if we take these basic questions even a step further and start thinking about equity in just a microcosm level within an organization in terms of what are the ways that leaders and the decision makers, what are those questions and choices that they're making in their everyday lives? And these are the questions that leaders and those decision makers should be thinking about from an equity lens in terms of who are you giving these big assignments or stretch assignments to for their professional development, or who are you choosing to hire, and how do you evaluate job applicants and candidates? Who are you giving professional development opportunities to, and who do you choose to mentor, or how do you choose to talk about your talent or folks in your organization when it comes to career opportunities? And again, as we consider these key questions, thinking about all of these questions from an equity lens, we're asking, what are the resources that we need to give folks to help level the playing field, and to see if they're to address the lack of any strong representation of either women or minorities or other underrepresented groups. Now, I understand that when it comes to all of these important considerations of how do we hire and how do we recruit, how do we promote, I know again that there's a lot of misunderstandings out there in regards to what is equity trying to accomplish, right? We all of us already identified some of those major things in our word cloud. And I want to directly address some of those biggest myths and misconceptions out there around equity and the federal regulations that support equity. And one of that being that equity just means simply that we're trying to meet hiring quotas and that we're basically trying to lower our hiring standards just to hire more women and minorities. And you know what? Let me just take a quick poll, and I'd love to hear from y'all. Are y'all kind of encountering the same kind of sentiments or thoughts around equity? And again, the sentiment that folks think that we're just trying to hire more women or minorities above everyone else. I'd love to hear from y'all what level of the sentiment, how pervasive the sentiment is within y'all's organizations. Do y'all see the word cloud or the poll?
Yes, I do.
And I know for me, I can say for me, this is a sentiment that we are seeing in our organization. Yeah. So it looks like for the greater majority of us, at least 75% of us, we're encountering these kind of negative sentiments one way or another in our organization. And I can't reiterate this enough, and I can't emphasize this enough, but quotas are explicitly prohibited by federal regulations, including affirmative action. And if folks actually took time to read affirmative action regulations when it comes to employers, one of the first things that they'll read is that the regulations do not permit quotas and preferences and set asides. All of those are strictly forbidden. So in other words, it's illegal for organizations to hire someone solely based on their race or gender or any other protected category. And at the end of the day, organizations, we all have to be looking to hire the best and brightest talent and the best and brightest candidates, right? But what equity and federal regulations like affirmative is asking is, what good faith efforts and what affirmative actions are organizations taking to cast as wide of a net as possible to find that best and brightest talent? Because we all know that not all the best talent comes from Ivy League schools, right? Or not all the best engineers are stereotypically male or Asian, right? And to be honest, one scenario and one question that I get from folks when it comes to how we hire and how we comply with affirmative action is, let's say I have two candidates who have exactly the same backgrounds and exactly the same qualifications, but one is a minority or female and the other isn't. Do I hire the minority and female candidate, and can I consider their identity as kind of a plus factor? Now, I just want to say that that's a big caveat. And again, when it comes to these federal regulations, we can consider the diversity of a candidate as one factor in their overall assessment of a candidate's backgrounds and qualifications. But whenever we're making an employee decision, we can never make an employment decision solely based or primarily based on the candidate's diversity. And the reality is that when companies and organizations treat our equity efforts simply as meeting a quota, then we actually run the risk of reverse discrimination. And actually, on a regular basis, organizations are being fined by the Department of Labor for reverse discrimination, for failing to properly understand affirmative action and treating it simply as these quotas to increase the representation and hiring someone simply because they're a minority or a female at the detriment of everyone else. In fact, last year in October, there was a jury in North Carolina that awarded a white male $10 million against his former hospital system for doing just that. That the organization was treating their DEI efforts as trying to meet a hiring quota. And to be honest, if I'm honest with y'all, this is very, very tricky. It's a fine line between avoiding treating it as a hiring quota and instead having what we call hiring goals and a placement goal. And when I say a placement goal, we're going to look deeper into what exactly does that mean when it comes to affirmative action. But really the key takeaway that I like for folks to understand is that equity and federal regulations that support equity, it's not about trying to meet a hiring quota or hiring a female or minority over everyone else. And at the end of the day, equity and the supporting federal regulations that support equity, it's again all about casting as wide of a net as possible to find that best and brightest talent. Now, another big misconception that I want to address is we hear a lot of folks saying that, equity is a thing of the past. We no longer need to level the playing field for underrepresented groups like women or minorities or the disabled community or veterans. That's all in the past. It's already, everything's already equal. When in reality, if you just take a look at the current news and current events, we are still seeing major companies who are being fined thousands to several hundreds of millions of dollars for discriminatory and harassing practices that are preventing underrepresented folks from, again, having that level playing field and thriving. And so just take a look at some of the major headlines of major companies and organizations that still have policies and procedures and practices that are holding people back. And I want you to just take a quick step back and think about the business impact and the ramifications of companies that properly don't have equity as a core value, and they allow these types of practices to still take place in the organization. Because right now we all know that finding talent in this market it's a universal challenge across all industries currently, right? We're still dealing with the Great Migration, and now there's this new phenomena in the labor market of quiet quitting, right? We're all hearing about how folks are kind of just disengaged and doing the bare minimum without quitting, right? And so we also know that job seekers, they pay attention to what a workplace culture is like. So imagine how difficult it is for an organization to.
I thought Chris Messer was the president.
And mute Annette.
I thought.
But again, imagine how difficult it is for an organization to attract talent and even retain their current talent when they are put in the public spotlight for not addressing these workplace issues and allowing these discriminatory and harassing practices to occur in their workplace. So I want folks to think about equity not just as complying with federal regulations, but even beyond compliance. We need to understand the bigger business impact on our company's brand and reputation and our ability to attract and retain talent when we don't have equity at the forefront. But again, these major recent headlines point to the unfortunate reality that we still need federal regulations to help level the playing field and make sure that companies and organizations, they are not engaging in these discriminatory and harassing policies. In fact, if you were to go on to the Department of Labor's website, they have on their website for public viewing major cases against companies for discriminatory practices. And you see on the right the different kinds of discriminatory practices they're seeing, whether it's in hiring or job segregation, even the types of discrimination, again, color discrimination, reverse discrimination, right? Code words or social discrimination. And so if you go onto the website and just take a look at all of these cases, what's a sobering reality is that these aren't cases from the 60s or 70s or 80s. These are still cases that are happening right now today. And if you read through some of these cases, a lot of these cases are really egregious. Now, I want to take a quick moment to look at what is really the scope and magnitude of how the federal government, they keep companies honest when it comes to these equity issues and enforcing federal regulations like affirmative action. So the OFCCP is one of those federal regulations agencies within the Department of Labor that is primarily charged with enforcing affirmative action and EEO. And here, what you see here are just some key facts and figures about how involved the OFCCP is enforcing these federal regulations. So in the course of 10 years, from 2012 to 2020 through 2022, the OFCCP has awarded over $218 million in monetary relief for employees and job applicants and candidates for discriminatory practices. And that $218 million was given to over 267,000 employees. And in that course of 10 years, they've looked at adjusting salaries and opportunities for over 25,000 jobs. And here's a big figure in terms of the sheer scope and magnitude of how the OFCCP reviews or how much they review. In the course of 10 years, they have reviewed, audited, and interviewed over 11.8 million workers across different organizations across the US. So in terms of these numbers and just the sheer volume of cases, the OFCCP, the federal government, they are serious about supporting equity issues in the workplace and leveling the playing field for folks. Now, I don't want to take any political stances here, and I'm not making any political statements, but I do want to address the misconception that affirmative action is politically motivated. We saw that in the word cloud, right? And that folks think that only certain political parties are more interested in enforcing affirmative action versus other political parties. Now, since the OFCCP has been in existence for several decades, since the 1970s, it doesn't matter who's been in the office, who's been in president, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, we have consistently seen the OFCCP enforce affirmative action regulations and keep companies honest. And if we take a look at this 10-year snapshot between 2012 and 2022, in that 10-year span, we've seen 3 different presidential administrations, right? We've seen Obama's administration, Trump's administration, and the current Biden administration. And just for folks to see how these different presidential administrations enforce EEO and OFCCP and affirmative action regulations during President Obama's administration. In his 4 fiscal years that he was in office, the single most amount of awards that his administration awarded in a single fiscal year was $26 million. But compare that to President Trump's administration, which again, who's a Republican, who's supposed to be his platform is all about pro-business and supposedly, being against affirmative action. But at his peak, his administration awarded almost double, $40 million in monetary relief, right? So it's important for folks to recognize that regardless of who's in office, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, everyone is enforcing EEO and affirmative action provisions and keeping companies honest when it comes to ensuring equity. Now, again, I'm going to speak more specifically about affirmative action next, but I know I've covered a lot so far, and I would love to take a pause and get anyone's thoughts, comments, or questions in terms of what we covered so far, in terms of how to think about equity every day in your everyday life, or what are some of the common misconceptions or myths, and how is the federal government enforcing affirmative action regulations or keeping companies honest about equity? Any thoughts or questions or comments so far?
For me, Jill, this is Kath, and my apologies for earlier. Employees call, and there's always a consideration that needs to be given, so I apologize. But I do work with Joe. My name's Kath Clausen, part of Southern Company Gas. But to your point, I think all of that, the idea of oversight, what is measured is cared for. When it's not measured, isn't cared for. But even if you are doing affirmative action plans and are not audited, the idea that we as an organization, not just us, but others, and just I think socially in the framework, these efforts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, they need to be grassroots. We need to thrive naturally. If this isn't natural and we just look at it as goals, whether they are defined or undefined, just the idea that if we are not treating each other in a well place, and it is not always defined by how we look at the diversity of veterans, individuals, women, minorities, but just in general, care for one another. Because we all know that even when OFCCP audits, sometimes it is not to the fact of looking at compensation or your plans and do they meet the structure, but it also is culture. When your slide that came up talking about individuals responding, they do interview employees. They do. That is just part of the process. So I think just in encapsulating everything that you put together, this is a way for us to thrive naturally in this environment that hopefully with this lengthy history we have of being monitored and cared for, that at some point in time, we won't need that oversight, that this will become part of who we are. To your point, looking at Amazon and some of the other companies on your slide, we're not there yet. I think I just saw another one yesterday where someone had a $375,000 settlement. So it still is ongoing. But that is the goal from all this, the idea that measure keeps us honest. And as with most things, there is some government element to it.
And Kath, I appreciate you sharing that. And let me share a little bit and kind of piggyback on what you're saying in terms of these efforts should be really organic. I like to think about DEI efforts as kind of two sides to a coin. There's the compliance piece in terms of what are we legally required to do, right? And that's really what this presentation is primarily focused on, the compliance piece. But then on the flip side, there's the commitment piece, right? Yeah. Beyond what we're legally required to do, what are we actually committing to do, right? And we'll talk through a little bit more about what does that commitment look like and some of those best practices when it comes to how we can address equity issues, not from a compliance and federal regulation piece or lens, but from a commitment lens. So I think you appreciate you sharing that.
Because for me, the idea of compliance, someone once said, that's safe.
Mm,
Compliance is safe. And when we go into that flip side of the coin of DE&I,
mm.
that is something that we can do better, and it becomes more about how we can, as individuals, and we as a collective and an organization, beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions, or comments so far about what we've talked about in terms of the compliance piece and kind of the historical context?
Yeah, Joe, I was sharing on the chat that there is definitely a need to continue to educate on this topic because unfortunately, old misconceptions are still very vivid and alive. And without education, it actually creates a microaggression for some individuals that are othered and stereotyped as recipients of a handout, and as if they're not deserving to be there. And therefore, that which we're all working towards, which is a sense of belonging, is thrown out the window because we are individuals that have the gut feeling and can sense when we don't belong because others think we don't belong there. So education can only help us undo a good portion of it, but then there's also actions and everything else that we're about to talk to.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, let me share my screen again and kind of switch and pivot lenses in and look specifically now at affirmative action, kind of do more education piece and deconstructing for folks, again, helping folks understand what actually is affirmative action, what it isn't, to help address those misconceptions of that we're hiring someone just simply because, not because of their backgrounds and their qualifications, but because of their diversity status, like Alejandro mentioned. Let me share my slide again. You know what, though? But before, now that we've kind of established how federal regulations have codified supporting equity in the workplace through federal regulations, I do want to take a closer look at affirmative action. But like we talked about, affirmative action is such a loaded term right now, and it's such a hot topic. And I know that even with affirmative action, there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings. So I'd love to do another word cloud with y'all and kind of understand from y'all and hear from y'all, what are some common misconceptions around affirmative action that y'all are hearing or seeing, whether it's in your workplace or even outside the workplace? But what are some misconceptions that you're hearing around affirmative action? Qualified people. Yep. And again, it goes back to that sentiment that we're hiring and we're just trying to meet hiring quotas, even though again, if folks actually took time to read the federal regulations around affirmative action, they will know and see clearly, quotas are explicitly prohibited. Yep. It's at the detriment of white men or not qualified, unfair. Yeah. The data is too complicated. You know what? I know that as for those folks, for those of us who actually work in the affirmative action, we can definitely attest to that, right? When you get the granular detail and look at affirmative action plans, and we'll speak more about that, it's like, whew, it can go over people's head and it can be very granular. Absolutely. Targeting, not equitable. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings right now around affirmative action. And so I think it's important that we take a closer look at what actually affirmative is and what it isn't. And really what I want to do is, first of all, I think it's important for folks to understand that affirmative action only applies to federal contractors, which means that you're an organization with 50 or more employees, and you have contracts with the federal government that's at least $50,000, right? So affirmative action regulations, they're generally applicable only to federal contractors, but I want folks to understand that even if you're not a federal contractor, it doesn't mean that your employees aren't protected by other federal regulations like EEO and Title VII, right? And your companies are still required to comply with those other federal regulations. But regardless of whether or not you're a federal contractor, there are procedural steps and best practices that federal contractors are required to take and document that any organization should follow, regardless, again, of whether or not they're a federal contractor. So again, I want to get that caveat out the way, and I want to let you all know that I'm only going to give you a 10,000-foot view of affirmative action, because again, for those of us who prepare affirmative action plans, you know that we can get sucked into the weeds and just get sucked into detailed statistics and numbers, and we all just lose folks, just right. We don't need to get there, but in its most basic and simple understanding, I want folks to understand that affirmative action requires organizations to create these detailed annual plans that show how the organization is taking affirmative steps to recruit, hire, and promote women and minorities, veterans, and individuals with disabilities. And again, like I shared previously, at the end of the day, the spirit of affirmative action is all about casting as wide of a net as possible to find that best talent and ensure that you're giving these historically underrepresented groups a level playing field. And so when it comes to establishing these detailed plans on an annual basis, all federal contractors have to prepare a very, very detailed annual report that includes this quantitative data, that includes all of your personnel activity, your employee base, looking at a 12-month period. You're looking at all your applicants, your hires, your promotions, and your terminations, right? And included in that quantitative data, all of these affirmative action plans, they have a highly detailed and very sophisticated data and survey analysis that gives us benchmarking data to show us what does your workforce currently look like compared to what it should actually look like. Because all that benchmarking data identifies what is a reasonable percentage of reasonably qualified minority females or minorities for every single job in your organization. So let's say, for example, if in my organization, for my technicians, my engineers, all of them are white males. But in my affirmative action plan, my benchmarking data shows that in a reasonable recruitment area, there's at least 40% qualified Black females for engineers. Then I may have what's called in the affirmative action world a placement goal, which means that I need to take affirmative steps to address that underrepresentation and cast as wide of a net as possible. And again, a placement goal is not a quota. It's more of kind of a aspirational benchmark that companies should make when it comes to what are called good faith efforts and actions to address that underrepresentation. And I want folks to understand that when it comes to these annual affirmative action plans, just because you have a placement goal for minorities or females in a job group, that doesn't mean you're automatically punished or dinged by the OFCCP. Instead, as part of that annual affirmative action plan, organizations have to provide this qualitative data that shows what good faith efforts are you taking to address that underrepresentation. And again, taking a step back, regardless if you're a federal contractor or not, and regardless of whether or not you prepare these annual affirmative action plans, all organizations should be tracking all this quantitative data in terms of what does your workforce currently look like in terms of your applicants, hires, promotions, terminations. And then we should all be doing this similar type of analysis in terms of, are we seeing any underrepresentation in certain areas? And then what qualitative actions, what steps are we doing to address that, right? Now, I would like to speak to some of those good faith efforts. And over the course of 50 plus years that the OFCCP has been in existence, they have reviewed and audited thousands and thousands of different companies across the US. And over that time, they've identified the best practices out there when it comes to companies that have done a great job in enhancing diversity, equity, inclusion. And so these are publicly available on their website, what you see here. And these are taken directly from their website in terms of best practices. But we see things like targeted outreach and targeted recruitment fairs, or having employee resource groups and employee business groups, or having targeted internship and mentorship and apprenticeship opportunities, or having partnerships with external organizations that are local, regional, or national, whether it's a minority serving institution or other organizations like, for example, the Society for Women and Engineers or the National Society for Black Engineers. There's also understanding the role of social media directing, and finally, having company-wide messages from your senior executives that sets the tone for the company's commitment for DE&I. Now, these are just a few of the best practices, and this is just a baseline. This is not a complete list of best practices that companies should be doing to address inequities in the workplace. But there's other things that organizations should be focused on, things like how we can improve the hiring process. One thing that we're doing at Southern Company Gas is in the last year, we've introduced what's called redacted resumes, where we remove personal names and we remove the names of schools to prevent hiring managers from introducing any biases in their hiring decisions. We're also requiring all of our hiring managers to take anti-bias training when it comes to hiring. Also continue to provide employees opportunities to share their feedback about the work environment, whether it's hearing from your ERGs. One thing that we do at Southern Company Gas is our executive DEI council. We meet regularly with our ERGs and have these focus group and listening sessions, or having company-wide DE&I surveys, or even gathering qualitative feedback around exit interviews and hearing feedback from employees that are leaving the organization about our workplace culture. And also providing any training and learning and development for employees, and especially our leaders, on developing DEI skills, right? Now, also, I'm sure that all of us working in the DEI space, there is constant pressure from our organization and our leadership to develop metrics and data and strategies. And so all of these best practices, we can tie key metrics and data and strategic initiatives around all of these best practices. But I'd like to take some time to hear from y'all and get understanding from y'all, which of these good faith efforts or examples of good faith efforts are y'all engaged in your organization? Why don't you take a quick moment to just identify some of the things that y'all are doing in your organizations? All right. It looks like in one way or another, a lot of folks are doing some form of something in all of these in this list. And I'd also like to encourage folks to come off of mute, and I'd love to hear from y'all to share what your organization has been doing in terms of some of these best practices, and if you've developed any metrics or data points around any of those efforts. Would love for anyone to come off of mute and share what y'all are doing.
And by the way, the answers on these polls are anonymous.
Thank you for sharing that, Alejandro.
Joe, I think we also have a question in the chat, just FYI.
Is it about the subcontractors also applying to? Yeah, it also does apply to subcontractors as well. I don't know the specifics and details of what qualifies as subcontractor. Kath, can you keep me honest on that? Do you know?
No, I not delved into that area myself, but do
Gotcha.
need to coordinate and get a better picture. I thought it was the same as because we are like an association, we are, they are, but I'd have to confirm that as well.
But yes, I can say affirmatively that it also affirmative action regulations and compliance does apply to subcontractors. But again, regardless of whether or not you are a subcontractor, right? There are best practices and procedures that we should all be following, regardless of our status as a federal contractor or not. I see that Stacy has her hand raised.
Hey, can you hear me? This is Stacy McCall.
Yes.
Right. I'm representing the Federal Reserve Bank today, so I just wanted to answer your question about. I was pleasantly surprised that I could check each one of these.
Mm.
We're doing a little bit of all of them.
Mm-mm.
That was one of the new initiatives we started over here at the Federal Reserve Bank, and just knowing our culture over here that we're nonpartisan and we're very conservative. Something new that we started was around social media.
Mhm.
And that was from our, Alejandro, are you telling me to speak up or are you just scratching your ear? You scratching your ear? Okay, okay. Speak up too? Okay. Okay. Is around social media. And that was a request from our employee resource networks saying, hey, we're doing a lot of good things inside of our organization. We'd like to share some of that outside of the organization. And how can we do that carefully and a little creatively? So we started some social media campaigns around what our employee resource networks are doing, and some recognitions, whether it be Black History Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, or Pride. So just some of the things that we're doing here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Stacy.
So thank you, Stacy, for sharing. I think we'll go to the panel and start some panel discussion. We've got about 15 minutes left, and we've got a bank of questions that we'd like to get. So I think I'd like to start with Alejandro. You know, we're currently in a time where organizations are rebranding their vision and goals for diversity and inclusion to now explicitly use the term equity. What is the importance of including equity?
Thank you so much, Lenny. I think Joseph said it best at the beginning. Historically, we have focused throughout organizations on on equality. Okay. So even when we use the word equity within our organizations, people are still going towards equality in their minds. So that's why we have to be very intentional on how we do and what we do in order to educate and introduce equity. Also, because if we don't educate the organization, if we are not proactive to bring equity to the forefront, it's going to backfire on us. Whenever we do something to create equity, people may see it as preferential treatment. They may see it as something else. If it's not, of course, if it's not done well, but also if there is not enough education, because of the stereotypes, because of the historical misunderstanding of what equity is. I guess we have said for the longest as a society that the meaning of insanity is doing the same thing, expecting to get different results. And it kind of works the same way with this, you know. If we keep throwing a broad blanket, expecting that will help us solve some of the issues to level the playing field, it's simply not going to work. Okay, we have to be very intentional, not just in our actions, but also on how we address equity, how we expose, how we educate on the concept of equity organizationally.
Thank you. And now that we have a proper understanding of equity, Joe, how would you recommend organizations go about educating others on the proper understanding of equity?
Yeah, well, I think what we just done, right? This session kind of leads into a little bit of that, what we're doing, right? And I think that all of us need to continue to understand, and we all do, obviously, the value and importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, but understand that it needs to be a commitment from the very top leadership of any organization, especially when it comes to equity, because again, we've seen the business impact in terms of the fines and the dings that you get from the federal government, but also the impact of the company's brand and image and ability to attract and retain talent. So we all, I think, recognize that equity is no longer the nice thing to do, right? There really is kind of it's crucial to the business. And like I shared in kind of the examples of best practices, I think organizations need to provide these targeted trainings for our leaders and the decision makers, and especially our hiring managers, around how to have an equity lens when making these everyday employment decisions for their talent. So I think that would be a great first step in terms of how we educate, because at the end of the day, it's the hiring managers, those leaders that are the decision makers, that impacts how equity shows up in your workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. Alejandro, I think you have something you want to add?
Yeah, real quick, and to piggyback on what Joe is saying, we also have to look at succession planning. and how we are equipping our leaders so that they are ready to exercise equity throughout the organization. Because what we're doing today, we can easily undo with having careless succession planning. So that's very key. And how do we, if that's not a skill that they have developed, then how can we help them develop a lens for equity so that in their practice they can start doing it before they get on the seat or the next seat that they're possibly within their line of succession.
Thank you. Kathleen, I'm going to turn this question to you. When talking about affirmative action, and I know we said we're not going to do a deep dive, but certainly we want to understand how, organizations, and Joe had mentioned metrics. So we do know that we use metrics and data in affirmative action to track when it comes to, representation. How can organizations then use these quantitative data and metrics to really develop their strategies around equity? And we'd love to hear what you're going to say, Kath.
Being respectful, Alejandro, thank you for the note there. That wasn't scratching your ear. I got that one. Well, hopefully that calms me down a little bit to answer the question. But overall, I do want to piggyback a little bit off of Alejandro and everything that we have heard today, because the idea of looking at equity, diversity, when Joe looks at the data of affirmative action, and if things are going well, there is an element of in succession planning thinking that I've got to educate the entire workforce. Because if we're not getting that person newly into the organization to understand it, then whatever we share, don't make it that it's so unique that you only have to be a leader to understand it and do it. So what my DE&I person in the business and his team can do is look at the data that we have. If things are going well in a particular area, then we can push that to the side a little bit and maybe not give as much attention to it. But where we really need to focus, then I need to engage more. I need to engage more with human resources. I need to engage more with talent acquisition. Where are the areas? And my ability to now speak with you today in ADMAG, what are the organizations? What are these efforts that exist across the company or outside of the company that can just make us better? And if we aren't utilizing all the tools and I'm not having these conversations and I just keep this data to myself, it's doing no service to anyone. Even if a leader understands the information and says I have a goal and we just do mechanize it, then that's not living our value in order to move things along in a better way. So if I'm not preparing the new person coming into the building, we're not going to achieve that. So in looking at the data, I need to partner with Joe to know where should we be looking? What are the areas that are important to affect that wider net or targeted net to finding those individuals, to Joe's point, engineers that might be from a minority group? And then what are we doing on the back end for our good faith efforts? So if I do find a historic Black college, what is the area that our business is working in? Do we need engineers? What historic Black colleges might have that engineering focus? How can we partner with them in order to build a curriculum that says, come to the gas industry? So there's various ways to look at it. So if we use that only as a small measure, it helps, to me, it opens my eyes to what we have to do and the work behind it to take those positive steps forward, those affirmative steps.
So Alejandra, I'd like to ask you the same question. What can companies do to properly leverage that representation data within an organization?
Well,
Can you share it with teams? I mean, what is it that you can do when you're inside the organization? What are some things you can do?
I'm going to take the liberty to also add and outside, okay? To answer your question. There is a fine line between what we now recognize as performative or transactional versus authentic Okay, so as leaders, we have to make sure that, like Joe said, we are doing this because it is the right thing to do, and not just because it is the compliance thing to do. Okay, um, people can, we are, as human beings, we can spot things when they're performative, and that's where companies get called out because of doing the kind of things. But in using those numbers to internally make things better, and we can only have a limited amount of staff in order to affect change and do things and invest our strength and energy, then we can focus our attention to where we need to and not spin our wheels where we already have good work that has been accomplished. Okay, so and that's where we're going to target our good faith efforts so that we are being productive on what we need to do. Now, I did say externally, we can also use external data to influence internal decisions to motivate better decision making when it comes to affirmative action or equity. For instance, I'm going to give you an example here. Just last year, 2021, the LGBT community, which is perhaps one of the most difficult topics in many organizations to this day, the spending was $1.4 trillion in U.S. economy. Okay, so that should tell us that perhaps we need to make sure that they're spending money in our organization. But how do we do that? They the LGBT community is only going to do business with our organizations if they feel welcome, they feel respected, and overall represented. Okay, so also the Latinx community, according to numbers, if the Latinx community within the U.S. were to be grouped as one country, it would be the 8th largest GDP. Okay, so the same way, if those numbers don't tell us that we need to have better representation, and the internal numbers don't tell us that we need to have better efforts in certain areas, I don't know what else can build a case.
Well, I want to thank all of you. We have a few minutes left, and I want to close out the session and give a couple of you, give our panel a final word. So, Joe, is there any takeaway you'd like to leave people with, a pithy statement or something? And then same for you, Kath, and Alejandro, I think you ended it well with what you shared.
Yeah, again, I think for me, the key takeaway is there's two sides to the coin when it comes to our DEI efforts. There's the compliance piece, what are we required to do? But like we said, right, it's not just performative. There's the commitment. What are we doing, committing to do, right, beyond just the baseline of complying with federal regulations? That would be my key takeaway for us to think about our equity efforts holistically that way.
How about you, Kath?
And for me, I'm going to take a two-sided coin approach too here, Joe. Mm-hmm. One is that while compliance is safe and easy and a must, the key is partnership. I'm appreciative of being part of this partnership today, but partnerships within our organization, to Alejandro's point, external. So those are the things that we need to take away. Keep the safe and easy, but we also have to partner to make it better. Can't do it alone.
Well, I want to take the time to thank all our panelists. You can thank them in the chat, or you can also thank them later for taking the time today to really give us the historical context of equity, and also the federal regulations, and then also how you can think about and use some of the discussion we had today to really improve your organization. And, you know, the key takeaways there that we last heard are extremely helpful. Again, thank you for all of the participants who joined us today, and also for those who are going to watch the recording, thank you as well. I want to wrap up and thank the audience and thank everyone, and tell everyone to have a great rest of day and a great holiday if it's such that you choose to celebrate.
Thank you, Lonnie.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.